Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of Ethical Hypothetical. We do have the same guests from last week, but in case you missed that episode, Emma and Lockie, give us a quick rundown of who you are. Lockie, let's hear from you first.
I'm Lockie. I'm a uni student at the moment. I'm also doing some stuff on social media on TikTok, YouTube, and Instagram. So living the life doing that as well. That's about me.
Beautiful. And Emma, go for it.
I'm also a uni student. I'm in my final year. I'm in the health field. And yeah, looking forward to graduating and working.
Yeah,
Nice.
fun times.
We've got Hara back after she cut out.
I'm
That's
alive.
South Australian internet for you.
Not
still
only
there.
am I depleted, but my internet is also depleted.
She's in a major
Oh, gosh.
caloric deficit. What's your body fat percentage right now, Hara, you reckon?
The machines are inaccurate. I'm that low in if I go to a machine, they're not. Like last time I checked, which was accurate, was 12%, but I should be 10 or under
Nice.
at the moment. Like I'm, yeah,
Wild.
yeah.
Anything below 10, very impressive. Well done.
Yeah, thanks.
Alrighty, so this episode we're going to deal with protesting, and when protests turn violent, what are the ethics involved there? Very relevant, I like to think. Okay, so first I'm just going to describe a situation. There's two protests here, and then I'm going to ask you some questions afterwards. So, a group of 10,000 are attending a protest. A small group of that 10,000 turn violent. They trash many small businesses. Innocent people are assaulted. One small business owner is killed. There is no adequate footage. It's a huge, violent mob, and we're unable to see which of the 10,000 protesters were the violent ones, but it was a small group of that 10,000. On a protest the next day, the police have been instructed to use necessary force if the protest seems like it is about to turn violent. One police officer notices a protester throw a rock towards the police. The police officer then gives the orders to retaliate. The police then use force. They use rubber bullets, tear gas. The protesters are dispersed. Many, including ones who were not violent, are injured. No businesses or bystanders are injured on this second day. So those are the 2 days of protests that have occurred. Now, can you all close your eyes? I've got some questions for you. Okay. On the first day of the protests, where the small businesses were trashed and people were assaulted and one person actually died, raise your hand if you think the organisers of the protest are the ones at fault. Okay, raise your hand if the police should be held accountable on that first day for not doing enough. Okay, just keep your hands raised for that one for me. Okay. All right, question 3. Raise your hand if the government should be held accountable for the trashed small businesses and the injuries and death that occurred.
So
Okay.
for the death, like that
For all
incident.
the yeah, including the death and the trashing of the small businesses. So I'll give you all a couple more seconds there. Raise your hand if you think the government should be held accountable. Okay. Number 4, raise your hand if you think it's too difficult to determine who is at fault, and unfortunately, the victims won't be able to receive adequate justice. So we've got a protest of 10,000 people. Some of them become violent, and we can't determine who those violent ones were out of the 10,000. The police didn't use much force. Businesses were trashed, and one person actually died. Other people were injured. Okay. All right. Now, number 5, we're going to the second day of protesting now, where the police were a bit more violent. Okay, raise your hand if you think the police went too far in this situation, in that situation where they used, so someone threw a rock and then they started using rubber bullets and tear gas. Okay, keep your hand raised for me. Okay. Raise your hand if you think the violent protester who threw that first rock should be held accountable for the other protesters that ended up injured. Okay, keep your hands raised. All right. Okay. Raise your hand if you think, like with the last question for the first protest, the whole thing spiraled out of control. Everyone acted in reasonable proportion, and unfortunately, the injured protesters are just a consequence that no one can be blamed for. Raise your hand if you agree with that general sentiment. So basically, no one can really be held accountable for their injuries there. Okay, and final question. Now, this is just a broad general question. Do you think if you join a protest, you give up some individual civil rights, and the protesters as a whole should be held accountable if some people in that protest turn violent, property is destroyed, other people are injured? Do you think you give up some of your civil rights by joining a mass protest like that? Raise your hand if you agree. Okay, again, a few of you looking a bit indecisive, so I'll give it a couple more seconds. Okay, alrighty, open your eyes. All right, there was a lot there. Yeah. So let's just go one by one. You had a whole range of answers there, but Emma, you didn't raise your hand in any of them.
Yeah.
So no one is being held accountable. Do you think that's just because it's just too hard with there's too many factors at play there that no one person or group of people can be held accountable, and it's just a sort of it's a tidal wave of small indiscretions that ultimately lead to people being injured or unfortunately killed?
I think it's a little bit of that. Also, if I had the ability, I would pick out those people who were the aggressors in the situation and punish them accordingly. Mm-hmm. I think that's the way to go. I don't think it's good in any situation to group people together based off a minority of poor behavior, acting kind of people. I think that, to put in kind of context, with the current protests in Melbourne about the anti-vax, I don't have any issues with them. That's their choice. I am very lucky to be in a country where we have rights and it's a democratic country. And whilst I have my own opinion, I don't want to force it on others. The only issue is when they were trying to harass and abuse healthcare workers, who are ironically the people who are trying to help them and save their lives because they choose not to take the vaccine. So it's kind of hard.
So let's go to the first question where no one raised their hand, and that was, should the organisers be held accountable? So if a protest does turn violent, even if it's a small percentage of those 10,000 people, let's say 100, so 1% of the 10,000 people have turned to violence there, do you think there's no situation where the organisers should be held accountable? What if the organisers are espousing very inflammatory rhetoric? We got to tear it down, the system is corrupt, we got to tear it all down. What if they say something like that? Do you think that goes beyond free speech and they are crying fire in a crowded theatre in that situation? Does anyone think there's ever a situation where the organisers can be held accountable?
Yeah. I certainly think if it's clear that people, because they always have either Facebook groups or WhatsApp group chats. So there's always records of what people have said. And I think if people, and they make the argument, oh, you can't imply or make assumption what I was saying, but if you can see that somebody's insinuating that people should act violently or using, really, like you said, inflammatory language, then I think they can be held accountable. But I think for the most part, you hear about peaceful protests where people say, we're just going there to have our voices heard to raise a little bit more awareness about our cause. And then, if there's some people who are obviously really highly emotionally strong about this issue, they might act out. So I think, I didn't raise my hand to say that they should be held accountable, but I think in those cases where the organisers are obviously trying to incite those kinds of things, then absolutely they should be held accountable.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah, agreed. Same.
Okay. Hara,
No,
you're a
I'm
bit
just
indifferent?
thinking. No, I'm thinking because it reminds me of what happened with Trump and like the January the 6th, the riots and everything, and how they're keeping him accountable, even though he wasn't even the organizer, but his language was apparently encouraging for people to break into the White House, and I've always thought that that's just extreme and unfair on him. Even though I don't necessarily like Trump, but still, I just don't think. So even with the organizers of any event, like unless you are encouraging people directly, I think you shouldn't be held accountable because it's not fair. Like someone might interpret like your language as, encouraging and other people may not. Like it's so ambiguous, I think. Yeah.
Unless
So I just don't think it's fair on the organizers.
Well, if it's vague or if it's subjective, I think you can't really blame the organisers. But if it's a direct call,
if it's
we need to tear it all down, something like
tear
that,
it all down or
then
put down the police or whatever. And with what's happening in Melbourne, like they're actually attacking the police people. Like if someone is encouraging and saying, yeah, let's do this, then yeah, of course. But
Yeah.
most of the time people don't do that.
And also with with a character like Donald Trump, I think it's important to realize how much influence you have over people. Like, because I understand the whole thing. It's like, well, that's not what I meant, but you're this, and that's why the argument kind of tears me up a little bit, because I am for like, well, it's not my responsibility. I just said this, right? But you do have so much influence over these people that are looking to you. You have a microphone. If you're not picking your words carefully and shit goes fucked, I feel like you do have a little bit of responsibility, like just a little bit. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
especially
but
if you would
be excluded from social media for like
no.
indefinite time. Like I
No.
think what they're doing, it's just ridiculous.
No, I just use the character as like the archetype of a leader. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
sure.
Because I think it's still, you have to keep in mind that these are people that will listen to everything you say. And if you're using words that sound a little bit dog whistly, you know what I mean? It's like your most extreme supporters will fucking find a reason to be like, what he wants us to do is go tear down the White House and go down into the caves. There's a lizard there. That's what he's saying. There's a king lizard.
But with that logic, then shouldn't they ban things like even just communism or something, because there's parts of that call for a revolution. So at what point do you say it's the responsibility of the people who actually undertake those actions and not the purveyors of maybe metaphors or just inflammatory language without a direct call for violence?
Well, I think it's what I'm trying to get at is if you're like you said, like if you said like use like the sentence tear it all down, right? That I guess you can interpret as a metaphor, but it also sounds pretty direct.
Yeah.
I'm using that as the example for this. If he was saying like enough of this or whatever the fuck, like really vague, I would give that a little bit more slack. But with stuff that is kind of like semi call to actions, I'm like, yeah, it gets complicated there.
Yeah, because I know that and you also got to be aware that there's some people who are really extreme in their views, and I know that there was people posting stuff because in his speeches he actually at some point he mentioned the date when it happened, before it happened, and he also mentioned something that was roughly their slogan. And I'm not saying he was doing that to like show support for them. But there were a lot of people who were supporters of this cause who saw that and they were like, oh, it's his way of sending a message to us. I think you got to be really careful because there's going to be a lot of people out there who are going to take what he says, even if it's someone that you disagree with, they're going to take what he says and think, oh, he's got our back, when really he might just be saying something that he believes and has nothing to do with your cause. And I think that's where you get into the area where it's some people who are really, really extreme with their causes and their beliefs.
Yeah, see, in that situation where they're like really trying to find shit, I would be like, no, that's not his fault. You're a psycho. But if it was a direct call to action or can be interpreted, like reasonably interpreted, I should say. Anything can be interpreted as a call to action, but reasonably interpreted, then I would be like, okay, yeah, you have a little bit of responsibility here.
Yeah.
Okay. Fair enough. All right, well, we can't spend too much on that one, although there's so much you can dive into there. The second question was, raise your hand if you think the police should be held accountable. Haro, you raised your hand, and Lockie, you raised your hand. So this was when small businesses were destroyed, people were injured, and someone actually died. So you guys think the police should hold some degree of responsibility there. Talk us through your thoughts on that one.
I was just going to say that, you gave the example on the second day where police were prepared and they were prepared to use force and they were told to use necessary force. I think they should be held responsible in some accounts. Not all the responsibility should be put on them, but the fact that they should be prepared for any protest to turn violent, no matter what the cause is, and just be prepared to, defend people's properties, defend people's businesses, defend people who are just innocent bystanders. And so I think, it's so hard for me to do this because my cousin's a police officer and I know how hard the job is, and to just tell them to do their job is really just, I don't know the word for it, but it's such a easy throwaway term. But at the same time, if you know there's a protest going on, make sure that you have enough police officers staffed around that area. If something does happen, they are prepared for it and they can use necessary force, whatever that may be. But I think the fact that they weren't able to do that and that there were victims as a consequence means that they do have to take partial responsibility.
Yeah, I agree.
All right, do you agree?
Yeah, I agree. I think, I think it's the responsibility of the police more than the government, which is the next question, because the police is meant to reinforce the laws made by the government. So, if there is, especially when there is dead people as a result of a protest, clearly the police was not there reinforcing the appropriate force, I guess, to disperse the violence.
Yeah, and even showing on the second day that they did have the capabilities to prevent that when one person threw a rock, shows that they were able to do something about it if something did occur.
Yeah.
Okay, well, the next one, Hara already touched on that. Raise your hand if you think the government should be held accountable now. No one raised their hand on that one. So, is there ever a situation where maybe victims or small business owners deserve some kind of compensation because, well, the police were maybe there weren't enough reinforcements, or there are just so many people at this protest, the police couldn't handle it, and it just got too out of hand. Does the government then need to say, look, we've failed our citizens. We haven't been able to create an environment where people who lawfully follow the rules and are just looking out to feed their families or innocently walk down the street have unfortunately been caught in the crossfire? There's not any accountability to be held there? None of you guys think?
I think, actually, that's a really good point to bring up. I think if no one actually points anything out, I think then the government should step in and be like, look, there's some form of injustice here. I know the police haven't addressed it. The people themselves might have not even addressed it. But being like, okay, if you have been affected by this, step forward and we can financially compensate or help you in terms of if they need, like, psychologist or some therapy because of the trauma associated with the event. I think they should step in and help the people.
Yeah, I agree with that.
I was hesitant.
Okay,
Sorry.
and then oh, yep.
I was a bit
That's all right.
hesitant with this question, and let me know what you think. I think the responsibility lies a little bit on the government if, let's say, they are taking some draconian like restrictions, like in Melbourne or New South Wales. And the reason actually why these protests are happening is because maybe people feel like their freedoms are, taken away in an extreme way. So that's why I was a bit skeptical about it, because I think if the government had acted differently, maybe these protests wouldn't even happen in the first place. So
True.
what do you think about that?
Yeah, that's I suppose when we're talking about who is to be held responsible for, the bystanders, the people who weren't part of either the protest or the people making the decisions to implement the lockdown or whatever it may have been, I just can't help but feel someone definitely has to be held accountable. And if we can't establish who the individuals who trashed the businesses and hurt people were, then I think and if the language used by the organisers wasn't seen to be reasonably inflammatory, and the police truly did everything they can, then I think the government has to step in and say, look, we've failed you. You guys just had businesses, you were just regular people walking around, and you were hurt and even killed. You deserve something. You deserve compensation or just an acknowledgement, an apology, something. I think then the government does have to,
definitely.
as a sort of as representatives of society at large, they need to say, yeah, society has failed you here.
Yeah.
And I think Hara also made a good point, like how people were put into lockdown and it's their sort of civil right to protest against it, and they were put in a situation where it's like stuck between a rock and a hard place. I can understand that, but I think it still lies on the individual citizens to take responsibility for the situation and work together to help people. Because at the end of the day, look, if COVID gets out and it spreads, it will kill people. Lives will be lost. That's the whole reason lockdown's happening, to avoid unnecessary deaths. They want everyone to get vaccinated, so the hospitals aren't overrided and then that will cause more people to die, more mortality, more comorbidity. Looking at from a health perspective, because it's a stupid situation as well. Like how allied health people, doctors, nurses, everyone are being attacked by these people, which I also think is a bit stuffed up. But they do have a right to say something. They don't, however, have a right to hurt people. There's a bit of a line, and it's very complex. It's hard to explore this issue, and the thing is, we don't have someone here who also is speaking from the protestants kind of perspective, so it's a bit biased because I don't know if anyone here actually went to the protest, but yeah. I don't know.
Yeah. Good point.
I suppose not just if I'm to put myself in their shoes, but not even just that protest. A lot of protests are embellished with a sense of such a complex injustice that a peaceful protest isn't good enough. There needs to be some form of very emotional, even violent resistance. And I keep saying tear it all down, but there is that sort of sense, at least from an outsider's perspective, for a lot of protests sometimes, because okay, we can no longer get what we're looking for within adequate democratic means. So we need to protest. Now, I don't see how attacking health workers who are just people who are doing their jobs is going to help the cause. But I guess in their mind, they're part of the problem. Like, they're enacting this medical tyranny. So I suppose they see them as the enemy, and as a result, they feel justified in attacking them because they feel like they're being controlled and feel like they don't have a choice. But again, I didn't go to it, so I don't know if someone listening went to any of those protests or sympathise with it and can articulate a better description of their aims by all means, go for it in the comments.
Yeah, if anyone watching this can articulate why it's okay to hit healthcare workers, go crazy.
They're not going to say anything. They're not going to say anything. No one's going to comment.
Well, I think it's just one of those things where it's like the second someone throws a rock, it's like you've just invalidated the entire thing. Like that's just all. It's like because.
But
you go. What were you gonna say?
I was just gonna say, but why has the actions of one invalidated the actions of, say, out of the 10,000, one person throws the rock? So moving on to that second day of protest now, all other 9,999 were peaceful. They were emotional. They were passionate. There was no violence, and then one person throws a rock, and then are you saying the whole cause gets invalidated?
This is they shouldn't. This is the thing. They definitely shouldn't, but they will because of how that will get covered. Because of how the media will represent it. It's like these violent... It was one dude. But you can't... And this is the thing, is you can't give them an excuse. If you're going to be so like, oh, the media represented us badly this way, it's like, you know that's their job. Their job is to find the most salacious, crazy way to put... Because we need a villain. We constantly need a villain in the media. You're the villain.
Like
we
the
can
guy
paint you like
punching the
this.
horse.
Yeah, it's like we need something.
Yeah.
And so I'm saying, if you're part of these things, don't give them a reason. It's like the same thing with when there were the protests in America and there were like pallets of bricks set up on the street. Did you see that?
That's so weird, and I don't understand that, not to get too Alex Jonesy here, but that sounds like there's some other actors at play.
That's
there.
what I'm saying.
That's so bizarre.
Because then there's the whole I forgot the term, but like sending in people to stoke violence because they know the media will run with that, and now you're all painted with the same brushstroke. And that's been I can't remember what it was called, but apparently that's a thing that's been happening since like the French Revolution, like sending in people that are meant to look you. Yeah.
Agitated.
And so, unfortunately, if there is a rock thrown, if there's a punch thrown, any of that, unfortunately, how it will get covered, you all will be invalidated. That shouldn't be the case, but I think that is the case.
Setting an example, like it could actually set an example. Like one person throws a stone, then the other person might do it too if nothing happens. Like if nothing happens to the person throwing the stone in the first place, so then it can actually may lead to something worse. And another death on the second day.
Yeah, and so coming to some of these last questions on that second day, for the police went too far. I think all of you put up your hand except Emma. So Emma, talk us through why you don't think the police went too far when, one of them threw the rock, and then they've said, okay, we don't want this to get any more violent, so we just need to use precautionary violence, if you will. Like, all right, enough protest now. One of you threw the rock, that's it. You all have lost your right to protest peacefully. What do you think, Emma?
From my perspective, I need to first know what equipment did the police have? How could they have retaliated? At the end of the day, there's more protesters than there are police. Could they have actually safely, if they're on horses, could they actually dismount safely and, control the crowd? They only take measures, I believe, that they have to take. And it's not like America. It's not like, a crowd was shot at. And, I'm not saying they deserved it, but I think given the circumstances, they were trying to defend themselves and control the situation. So I believe I'm kind of giving them the benefit of the doubt here, in that circumstance. And like, honestly, a lot of people will be like, they went too far. They shouldn't have used X, Y, Z. At the end of the day, if there's no long-term side effects of what the police did to them, and, after about 12 hours or something, they made a full recovery from, the tear gas or whatever that was used, not tear gas, pepper spray and whatnot, I think they did their best. And I think it is what it is at the end of the day, like, if someone came up to you, if a gang of people and you were just by yourself and, they were threatening to bash you up, right? A baseball bat's not going to be enough for like 6 people bigger than you, right? You're going to have to get pepper spray or, rubber bullets. As long as they don't get seriously injured, I think they took fair measures, in my opinion.
Okay.
See, I would tend to disagree in the fact that I think in a protest where if everyone is doing the right thing and protesting what they came to protest about and they're not harming, small businesses, innocent bystanders, and then you have one person act out, I think, first of all, there is the case where the protesters need to distance themselves from that person and realize, we have the same view about this particular cause, but we don't believe in using violence when bringing awareness to this cause either. And so I think, if they're going to act violently towards the police, protesters can have the same mindset as that person, but I think they should be distancing themselves from that person unless they also want to act violently, then, join them, I guess. But I think the police should be able to single that person out without using excessive force, especially force on people who haven't done anything wrong. And at the same time, I think having not to sound like 2GB too much, but having a little bit of common sense and knowing that that one person is doing the wrong thing and not everyone here is going to be thinking the same thing, and that the police, they may be... I can't go into what they think the police's orders would be, but if they've been told, we want this to be a quick protest, we don't want this to go on too long, and we want this to be shut down fairly quickly, and if the police are looking for a reason to do that and one person throwing a rock causes that, then I don't think that's the case usually. I think that's probably a bad example on my part, but at the same time, I think the police knowing that one person throwing a rock, they can single that person out. But at the same time, you talk about if it's not going to cause them harm that lasts more than 12, 24 hours. I think a lot of times people, they may not get physically or mentally injured, but they're now going to have distrust with the police.
Yeah.
And every time they go out to protest, they're going to have that expectation that police are going to act violently over very small things.
That's
so I
a
think
good point.
the responsibility is on that person to not act violently and act within the parameters of that protest where you're trying to get awareness of the cause, not, like Alex said, have the media show this clip of someone throwing a rock, because the media knows that the things that will get clips is what gets the biggest emotional rise out of people. So if they see people fighting, riding, punching a horse, it's going to get the most clicks and most attention.
But but in that situation, it was one person throwing a rock. What if, say, out of 10,000, it's 50 or something like that? At what point do you say, no, we just have to disperse this entire protest and we can't afford... it's too hard to just single out the violent ones from the non-violent ones?
And I think another important point you said, if the protesters kind of distance themselves, and the thing is the police can't see where it's coming from, they're going to immediately retaliate to protect themselves. I'm not saying that they're necessarily in the right. It's wrong to injure bystanders. I agree with that. But in that situation, what would you do? What is the realistic, kind of scenario?
Yeah, I think, because in my mind, the guy who's throwing the rock is at the very front. You can see exactly who it is. They just go, it's that guy. But in those cases,
you can't just call him out and be like, who did that?
Yeah, red shirt, blue hat.
1v1, let's go.
But yeah, I think at the same time, if you've got a case where there's numerous people who are acting violently and there's no way to subdue that, control that, and people aren't distancing themselves, you're not able to... I don't think it's no longer a protest. It's now become something violent. And even if it is that very small minority group who is doing it, which is a massive shame for the people who are trying to protest the right cause, I think at that point, you do have the responsibility on the police to disperse that crowd in the most peaceful way possible. And I think the problem is there's no way of saying like, okay, 1, 2, 3, okay, we got to 15, now we can disperse the crowd because 15 people are throwing rocks. There's no like magic number where they can say, all right, now it's violent.
Yeah.
So a lot of times it is up to the police. That's why I think it is such a difficult job to find that line between trying to keep a peaceful protest and knowing when to intervene and how to intervene as well. So yeah, it's a good point, Neil.
And the second last question was, do you agree with the statement that, no, unfortunately, it's sort of like a butterfly effect here. One person throws a rock and then as a result, the police start shooting rubber bullets. And then as a result, more people start throwing bottles and rocks. And then as a result, it spirals out of control. So who is really to blame in that situation? Because if businesses get burnt down and people get injured, well, the person who threw that initial rock was like, well, I just threw one rock. I didn't want all this to happen. So it is a tough situation, and who is held accountable there? It's not easy. I think there are trade-offs with something like this. So Hara, you raised your hand for the whole thing spiraled out of control, and unfortunately, no one can really be held accountable for those protesters' injuries. What would you say to, someone, maybe even someone who's a child, like a 14, 15-year-old who's just there trying to protest for a cause that they feel is the right thing, and then they end up with all these rubber bullets?
Well, I think it's a risk we take if we want to join a protest, especially if you know it's gonna get emotional and maybe violent. It kind of goes to the people attending. Some part of the responsibility. You may get hurt, so that's just a fact. And when things get as complicated, like you're saying, someone initiates something and then the police, and then it's just spirals down from there. It is what it is. Like you can't argue it. Like how do you find? I don't know if anyone thinks otherwise, but I just find it so hard to then pinpoint the start, because it could be. Personally, I would just say the government. Maybe if the government had different rules, none of this would have happened. And then it would go back to the people. And if the people had maybe voted a different government, maybe we wouldn't have, been in the situation where we are now. So you can keep arguing about it. So yeah, I don't know.
It's just mob mentality, isn't it? Because it's hard to really just find who's individually culpable in situations like that. And then that brings us to the last question, which was a broader question. Do you think if you join a protest, you give up some civil rights, and that protesters as a whole should be held accountable if there is damage from the protest? So I suppose in a situation like that, like in America last year, or even here, what's currently happening in Melbourne, if there is property damage, if there are people who are injured, do you think everyone who was at that protest has to have some degree of accountability, especially if they can't ascertain who the exact perpetrators were? I think I agree with that, but then I tend to think that can so easily be taken advantage of, where at a protest someone will say, well, everyone has to wear masks, and then, everyone's held accountable, but 10,000 people are held accountable if someone dies, then it's hardly that much account. It's a tough situation. I do think something probably, you have to think about it differently when we're dealing with giant mobs of people like this. It's hard to just say, the usual individual rights apply here, because it's almost like a big organism, operating. Yeah. So I don't know. I tend to side with the, law and order on these sorts of issues. So I tend to give the benefit of the doubt to the police, like with Emma, because I think, maintaining the peace and just ensuring bystanders aren't injured and businesses aren't damaged, to me is like a massive priority. And I think you probably do abrogate some rights when you join a protest, but that's also a very slippery slope. So yeah. It's a tough one, but I think I agree to a certain extent with that statement. But like, you raised your hand for that one. Talk us through your reasoning for that, and then we'll get everyone to give some concluding remarks and wrap this one up. So what do you think, Lockie?
Yeah, I think it's a good point you bring up about, you can have a massive amount of people at a protest, and then if a few people act out, you suddenly are asking everybody to take account when maybe not everyone was acting in an unlawful way, or even just a way that was unfavourable to the community they were in. But at the same time, I think maybe me putting up my hand doesn't quite correlate with the actual question, because I think you give up your rights if you act unlawfully, for me.
Sure.
So, that even falls into just like, if you break a law, then, you can be arrested. But I think that's kind of where I'm coming from. I don't think you really give up any of your civil rights, but I think if you start acting unlawfully, or you start acting violently, or a way that might incite a riot or incite violence, then, I think that's the problem that you have with a lot of protests. People will do things, out of emotion, or to try to get people riled up about the situation, even if they don't feel like they're inciting violence and they just think they're making a really good point. They could cause something worse to happen. And I think in a lot of times they can be arrested, they can be apprehended by police, and they suddenly say, I was just peacefully protesting. And, a lot of times police have to take precautions with certain individuals. If certain individuals are getting up, with a megaphone and saying things unsavourable that could cause people to act out in a certain way. On one hand, you could have police come up to them and speak to them about just either toning it down, but then, people are going to bring up, oh, well, it's my free speech, I can say what I want. And there's so much grey area.
Yeah.
But for me, I just think if you go to a protest, like you said, you have to be prepared for there to be police presence. And I think everyone should have the right to protest. You should be able to go out and protest, but do it in a way where you're creating awareness about your cause, whether you want the government to acknowledge that, you want people to acknowledge that, the police to acknowledge that, whatever the cause is, without acting violently, and especially not towards healthcare workers like what's happening right now. I think it's disgusting that people are attacking healthcare workers who don't make the rules. They simply take care of the people who are in the worst states at the moment. I find it ridiculous that those people are being target the government if you want for making the rules, but do not target medical workers. I think it's appalling.
Yes.
If that makes sense. That was a quite
No.
roundabout way of making my point.
Makes a lot of sense. Like you say, it's so much grey area because I think most of my empathy, for whatever reason, tends to side with the innocent bystanders there and the people who are just going about their business and are just collateral damage to these to this loggerhead where there's the police and then the protest group, and they're the ones who suffer. So whatever precautions need to be taken to ensure the safety of bystanders, including health workers, who I haven't been following this in too much detail, but I don't think they're actually part of either side of the protest. They're just trying to help.
Correct.
Probably just, helping people who were injured from the protest. So I think you do have to draw a line there and say, well, look, if even if it's a small portion of the crowd that are being violent, no, enough's enough. Like, the police have to step in there and just disperse the crowd and use whatever necessary force. But it's a tough one because then, yes, there also could be innocent people there almost certainly will be innocent people in the protest, and there is a cost either way. Emma, Alex, and Hara, let's hear your concluding remarks on this issue at large. It's very relevant. There's protests going on over the last 2 years. Just every 3 months, there's a new cause that a large group of people are protesting for. So, what do you think?
I 100% agree with you in that regard. At the end of the day, I don't want anyone to get hurt at all. But, the police take measures to protect the bystanders, which are the majority in this scenario. And, I don't want any protesters to get in the way of harm. So I would just say, if you are a protester, stay away from trouble. Just run. Like, if you see someone, throw a rock, run in the opposite direction, because the probabilities that the police will act to kind of disperse the crowd, whether that be by violent means. And I'd say this is a very grey situation. Everyone's made very valid points, and I agree with everyone. I don't think anyone's made an unreasonable point. So at the end of the day, just weigh your beliefs against society's beliefs and the consequences of that, and just, act as appropriately as you can do, I guess,
Alex?
Yeah, I'm kind of on the same page with everybody here. I'm sort of with Hara on the whole idea of sort of what happens when you're in that big of a group. Because also, unfortunately, the thing is, when you're in any kind of group, you are only as strong as your weakest link. And if shit goes down, you're going to be associated in some way. It shouldn't be like that. It totally shouldn't be like, it's like, so obviously that, like, if we're being like, okay, well, what's fair? It's like, it's obvious, if you weren't part of it, you shouldn't have any responsibility there, but you will be looked at in that way. And that's, I think, the risk that comes in when you join a protest. I know there's the arguments for freedom of speech, freedom of expression, all of that. And I'm like, yeah, that's all great on paper, but what people are going to look at it like is completely different.
Yeah.
So I think, yeah, and that's kind of further to Emma's point of, like, just if you're part of it, just fucking do your best to not get caught up in the shit. I think that's it. But ultimately, I agree with being able to get out there and peacefully protest. I totally agree with that.
And Hara?
Yeah, I think everyone has summarized my opinion. I think, like Alex said, well, is this fair? Well, is the world fair? Exactly. Not really. So, yeah.
That's a cynical,
Although
very
I think,
cynical note
I
to
know,
end
I'm
on.
sorry, it's very negative. I'm just hungry.
That sucks, people.
Just end the video right there. The world isn't fair. Cuts to black.
Bye.
You have no right to justice. Bye, people. All right. Thank you for that discussion. That one was really, really great. A lot to think about there. One more time, guys. What are your socials if you'd like people to check you out?
Mine is lock_Mac on TikTok and Lockie.McIntyre on Instagram if you want to check that out.
I'm Alex Milinkovic on Instagram, ALEKS. That's how you spell it. That's everything.
I don't have anything, but have a great day, guys. Thank you so much.
That's wholesome. All right. Bye, guys.
Wait.
Bye.